One phone call, everything unraveled. Welcome to the silent Clueworks. I am your host, Echo of Silence. Tell me where you're tuning in from. Your presence means more than you know. Now, straight into the mystery. The phone rang at 11:17 on a Thursday morning, which violated at least two of the sacred rules that keep Nero Wolfe's world spinning in its proper orbit. First, it interrupted what he calls his morning session with correspondence, during which disturbances are supposed to be filtered through me like coffee through cheesecloth. Second, it rang while Fritz was in the kitchen preparing what he had mysteriously described as a small experiment with saffron, and I had been specifically instructed to taste it at 11:30 sharp. I was seated at my desk in the office, and working through a stack of bills that had accumulated while Wolfe indulged his latest enthusiasm for a rare species of Paphiopedilum orchid. The sound cut through the comfortable silence like a fire alarm in a library. From behind his desk, Wolfe looked up from his current book, a biography of Escoffier, and frowned in my direction as if the interruption was somehow my fault. "Nero Wolfe's office," I said into the receiver. "Archie Goodwin speaking." The voice that answered was female, middle-aged, and carrying the kind of controlled tension that comes from trying very hard not to sound desperate. "Mr. Goodwin, my name is Elena Vasquez. I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe immediately. It's about his privacy." That was an interesting opener. In our business, people usually want to hire Wolfe to invade someone else's privacy, not protect his own. "Sir, Mr. Wolfe is currently occupied," I said, glancing at him as he turned a page with deliberate precision. "He sees clients by appointment only. What's this regarding?" "Someone has been watching your building," she said, "taking photographs, making notes about who comes and goes. They've been asking questions about Mr. Wolfe's routine, his habits, his schedule." I sat up straighter. "Who's been asking questions?" "I don't know, but yesterday I received a phone call. The person said they had compiled what they called a comprehensive dossier on Mr. Wolfe's private life. They said if I didn't cooperate with certain demands, they would make it public." "What kind of demands?" "I can't discuss that over the phone. But Mr. Goodwin, you have to understand, I never wanted to involve Mr. Wolfe in this. I told them I wouldn't do what they wanted, but they said they didn't need my cooperation anymore. They said they had enough information to proceed without me." I looked across at Wolfe. He had closed his book and was listening with the expression of a man who has just discovered a slug in his salad. The sanctity of the brownstone, his carefully maintained privacy, his insistence on controlling exactly when and how the outside world intruded. These weren't just preferences for Wolfe. They were articles of faith. "Mrs. Vasquez," I said, "what exactly is your connection to this situation?" "I used to work for a private investigation firm. I left 6 months ago, but I still have access to certain files. They want me to provide them with detailed information about Mr. Wolfe's personal habits, his security arrangements, his vulnerabilities." "And you refused?" "Of course I refused. But they made it clear that my refusal was merely an inconvenience, not an obstacle. They said they would get what they needed with or without my help." Wolfe had risen from his chair and was standing behind his desk, his hands clasped behind his back. When he spoke, his voice was deceptively calm. "Archie, ask Mrs. Vasquez if she can be here at 3 o'clock this afternoon." I relayed the question. She said yes. She could be there in an hour if necessary. I told her 3 o'clock would be fine and got her address for confirmation. After I hung up, Wolfe remained standing for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular. Finally, he moved to the window and looked out at 35th Street with the air of a general surveying a battlefield. "Archie," he said without turning around, "someone appears to have declared war on this house." "Looks that way. What do you want to do about it?" He returned to his chair and picked up his book, but I could see he wasn't reading. "We shall do what we always do when confronted with presumption," he said quietly. "We shall demonstrate why it is unwise to disturb the peace of civilized men." The phone rang again. This time I let it ring twice before answering. Something told me our quiet Thursday morning was about to become considerably more complicated. "Nero Wolfe's office," I said. "Goodwin speaking." "Mr. Goodwin," said a different voice, male and coldly amused. "I believe you've just spoken with Elena Vasquez. I wanted to call and introduce myself. You can think of me as someone with a professional interest in your employer's habits. I'll be in touch very soon." The line went dead. I looked at Wolfe, who was watching me with raised eyebrows. "Well," I said, hanging up the phone, "I think we just met the opposition." Wolfe grunted and opened his book again, but his eyes weren't moving across the page. The war, it seemed, had officially begun. Fritz appeared in the doorway at 11:30 sharp, carrying a small porcelain dish that released an aroma suggesting his saffron experiment had succeeded admirably. He took one look at Wolfe's face and stopped as if he'd walked into plate glass. "Not now, Fritz," Wolfe said without lifting his eyes from the book he still wasn't reading. Fritz vanished back toward the kitchen with the silent efficiency of a man who had learned to read atmospheric pressure changes in that house better than any barometer. As in 20 years of working there, I'd seen him navigate Wolfe's moods like a ship's captain threading dangerous waters. If there's one thing guaranteed to sour Nero Wolfe's disposition faster than a wilted orchid, it's the suggestion that someone is making a hobby of observing him. He considers being watched something a civilized man submits to voluntarily, preferably while seated comfortably and compensated for the inconvenience. The idea that some anonymous joker was compiling what he called a comprehensive dossier wasn't just a nuisance, it was a declaration of war against everything Wolfe held sacred. He didn't announce this, of course. Wolfe rarely labels his emotions where they might be overheard. Instead, he reached for the button that would summon Fritz back. "Yes, monsieur." Fritz appeared with the wariness of a man approaching a sleeping tiger. "Until further notice, no one enters this house except at Mr. Goodwin's express approval," Wolfe said in the tone he reserved for matters of absolute importance. "No messengers, no deliveries, no solicitors of any description. If something requires delivery, Mr. Goodwin will inspect it before it crosses the threshold." Fritz's eyes widened slightly, which on him was equivalent to another man fainting dead away. "Is there danger, sir?" "There is presumption," Wolfe replied. "That is sufficient." After Fritz retreated, I opened my desk drawer and checked the point .38 that had been gathering dust there for the better part of 6 months. Not because I expected an immediate assault, but because rituals matter when you're feeling the walls close in. "You want to tell me what's really bothering you about this?" I asked, swiveling to face him directly. Wolfe set down his book with the careful precision of a man handling nitroglycerin. "The usual threats we receive are crude instruments wielded by crude minds, Archie. They announce themselves with bluster because they possess nothing else. This is different." "How different?" "They contacted Mrs. Vasquez first, not us. They wanted us to understand that our privacy had already been compromised before making direct contact. That demonstrates planning, patience, and a sophisticated understanding of psychological pressure. The follow-up call came within minutes, which means they were monitoring her line or had anticipated her appeal and prepared accordingly." I had to admit he had a point, and most threatening calls we received ran along the lines of, "I'll burn down your house," or "You'll regret the day you were born." This felt more like a chess master announcing checkmate 3 moves before it happened. "So, what do you want me to do about it?" "2 things. First, call Saul Panzer. I want to know if this house is currently under surveillance, and if so, by whom and with what resources. Tell him to be subtle. If they're professionals, they'll spot anything obvious." I got Saul on the phone and explained the situation in 30 seconds. He said he'd be conducting what he called a casual architectural survey of the neighborhood within the hour. That was Saul's way of saying he'd identify every possible observation point within 3 blocks without appearing to do anything more interesting than walking his dog. Second, Wolfe continued, make a circuit of the immediate area. You know this neighborhood well enough to distinguish the native fauna from exotic additions. I put on my coat and hat and stepped out into the November air, which had the kind of bite that made me question every life choice that had led me away from Southern California. I made a casual loop, down to 9th Avenue, back up the opposite sidewalk, around the block. The local scenery included a delivery boy I recognized, 2 construction workers who were genuine enough to ignore me completely, and a woman walking a dog wearing a sweater that cost more than my rent. There was also a man in a tan overcoat standing at the corner bus stop, studying the schedule with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. His shoes were wrong. Handmade English leather, or too clean for a man who actually rode public transportation. When I glanced his way, he looked away just a fraction too late. I wandered over and admired the bus schedule alongside him. Don't take it personally, I said conversationally. They never arrive when they're supposed to. He measured me with his eyes, calculated the odds, and decided he didn't like them. Without a word, he walked off toward 8th Avenue. Not hurrying enough to be conspicuous, but moving faster than a man who'd suddenly remembered a dental appointment. I let him go. Suspicious behavior doesn't constitute a crime, and I didn't have anything on him except expensive footwear and poor acting skills. Back in the brownstone, I found Wolfe exactly where I'd left him, although he'd progressed to staring at the wall above my desk with the expression of a general contemplating siege warfare. One possible watcher, I reported. Tan overcoat, good shoes, bad timing, departed when I got friendly. Expected, Wolfe grunted. They want us to know we're being observed. It's part of their strategy. The phone rang again. I was beginning to develop a personal grudge against that particular sound. Nero Wolfe's office, Goodwin speaking. Mr. Goodwin, this is Elena Vasquez again. Her voice carried more strain than it had an hour earlier. I need to move our appointment up. Something's happened. What kind of something? They delivered an envelope to my apartment 20 minutes ago. It contained photographs of Mr. Wolfe's office, recent photographs. They're proving they can reach anywhere they want to reach. I looked at Wolfe, who had turned from his wall staring to watch me with the expression of a man who had just decided that diplomacy was overrated. How recent are we talking about? Yesterday, I think. Maybe this morning. The morning light is coming through the windows at the same angle it is right now. Mrs. Vasquez, how quickly can you get here? 15 minutes. Make it 10. After I hung up, Wolfe remained silent for a long moment, his massive frame motionless, except for the slight pushing in and out of his lips that meant his brain was working through something complex and unpleasant. Archie, he said finally, it appears we are not being hired to solve a mystery. We are being conscripted to repel an invasion. Someone has violated the sanctity of this office, and they want us to know it. This is no longer about money or information. This has become personal. He stood and moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back, studying 35th Street as if it were enemy territory. When Mrs. Vasquez arrives, he continued without turning around, we will learn exactly what we're facing. Until then, we prepare for war. The doorbell rang at 2:57. I went to the front hall and peered through the one-way glass at a woman who looked like she'd spent the last 24 hours deciding between fleeing to Mexico and knocking on our door. She'd chosen us, which might have been the braver option. Elena Vasquez was younger than her voice suggested, perhaps 35, with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that had seen more than they'd wanted to. She wore a gray raincoat that had weathered several seasons and clutched a leather handbag as if it contained state secrets. Mr. Goodwin? She glanced over her shoulder before meeting my eyes. I wasn't sure you'd actually see me. Since someone else already knows you're here, I said, stepping aside. "You might as well come in where it's warm." I led her to the office, where Wolfe sat behind his desk like a mountain that had decided to make itself comfortable in a valley. He didn't rise. Wolfe never rises for anyone except royalty and prize orchids, but he inclined his head a precise fraction of an inch. "Mrs. Vasquez," he said as she settled into the red leather chair, "Mr. Goodwin informs me that you are being pressured to provide information about my private affairs. Before we proceed, I require complete honesty. Who is applying this pressure, and why do they believe you have access to what they want?" She sat forward, gripping her handbag. "My former business partners. I worked for a private investigation firm called the Argus Group until 6 months ago. It was run by a man named Julian Kincaid, who died 2 weeks ago of what the coroner called a heart attack." "You sound skeptical about the coroner's conclusion." "Julian was 42, ran 5 miles every morning, and had the constitution of a draft horse. But that's not why I'm here." She paused, gathering herself. "Julian was more than an investigator, Mr. Wolfe. He was a collector of secrets, corporate espionage, political blackmail, personal scandals. He kept it all in what he called the ledger. When he died, the ledger disappeared." Wolfe's eyebrows rose slightly. "And your former colleagues believe I possess it?" "They think Julian sent it to you before he died. 3 hours ago, I heard him mention having a fail-safe protocol involving the only man in New York he respected enough not to open a sealed package. He meant you, Mr. Wolfe. Now the 3 people fighting for control of the firm are convinced you're holding the key to everything." "I have received no package from Mr. Kincaid," Wolfe said flatly. "Sealed or otherwise. Who are these 3 aspirants to his throne?" Elena counted on her fingers. "Marcus Thorne ran physical surveillance. He's the one who called you. I'm certain of it. He believes in direct action and has the moral compass of a shark. Lila Banning handles the technical side. Wiretaps, computer infiltration, electronic surveillance. Now, she's quieter than Thorne, but twice as dangerous. And Arthur Cole was the business manager, the public face. He's smooth, connected, and desperate to keep the firm's illegal activities buried." Wolfe leaned back in his chair. "And you, Mrs. Vasquez, what was your function?" "I was the analyst. I connected dots, found patterns, made sense of information. I left because I saw what they were becoming." Her voice dropped. "Thorne told me that if I didn't help him map out your security arrangements so he could retrieve the ledger, he'd frame me for Julian's murder, and he has the connections to make it stick." I looked up from my notebook. "So we have a thug, a hacker, and a suit, all convinced the boss is sitting on a gold mine of blackmail material." "Precisely," Wolfe said, and his expression had settled into the cold calm that meant someone was about to regret having attracted his attention. "Mrs. Vasquez, you mentioned photographs of this office. I assume they were intended as proof of capability." "They want you to know they can reach you anywhere," she confirmed. "Thorne has a surveillance van positioned on 34th Street with a direct line of sight to your plant rooms. Lila has probably already compromised your telephone lines. And Cole is working his contacts to find legal pressure points." Wolfe closed his eyes and sat in silence for nearly a minute. When he opened them again, his voice carried the chill of an Arctic wind. "Archie," he said, "it seems these people are laboring under a fundamental misapprehension. They believe that because they have made themselves my enemies, I will be frightened into cooperation. They are about to learn otherwise." He turned to Elena. "Mrs. Vasquez, you are going to return to your former colleagues. You will inform them that you have succeeded in your mission. You will tell them that I do indeed possess Mr. Kincaid's ledger and that I am prepared to negotiate its return. But first, I want to meet with all 3 of them here. Tomorrow evening at 9 o'clock. Elena stared at him. "Mr. Wolfe, you just said you don't have the ledger." "I don't," Wolfe replied calmly. "But they will not believe a simple denial. Their greed and paranoia have progressed too far for rational discourse. We must use their own avarice to draw them into the open, where they can be dealt with properly." He stood and moved to the window again, looking out at the street where someone was undoubtedly watching us watch them. Besides, he added softly, they have made the mistake of invading my privacy and threatening my peace. That requires a response, a definitive one. Elena returned at 5:30 with the haunted expression of someone who had just agreed to walk back into a cage full of hungry lions. I let her in through the front door, noting that the blue parka from earlier had been replaced by a man in a navy peacoat who found the bus schedules across the street fascinating enough to study for 20 minutes. They bought it, she said without preamble as she settled into the red leather chair. All three will be here tomorrow night at 9, but they're not happy about being summoned. Wolfe grunted without looking up from the manila envelope she'd brought earlier. So he had spread the photographs across his desk like a general studying battlefield maps, his eyes moving from one to the next with methodical precision. The quality of light suggests these were taken this morning between 9 and 10, he said finally. Mr. Goodwin, compare the arrangement of objects in the photographs to their current positions. I studied the images carefully. Everything looks normal except for one thing. The spice jar on the bookshelf behind your chair. In the photos, it's to the left of the blue orchid monograph. Right now, it's on the right. Bring it. I fetched the small glass container and set it on his desk. Wolfe unscrewed the lid, inhaled, and his eyebrows rose fractionally. Mrs. Vasquez, you are familiar with culinary herbs? She leaned forward cautiously and sniffed. That's not marjoram. Something harsher. Indeed, someone has substituted the contents. Wolfe's voice carried the chill of an Arctic wind. They wish us to understand that they can reach into this office at will. It is a demonstration of access, not an attempt at poisoning. If they intended harm, I would already be dead. He stood and moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back. However, their theatrics have revealed something they did not intend. Mrs. Vasquez, when did Mr. Kincaid first mention his fail-safe protocol? About 3 years ago. He said he had arranged for his most sensitive materials to be sent to the one man in New York he trusted not to open a sealed package without cause. Archie, Wolfe said suddenly, has anything unusual been delivered to this house in recent weeks? I was about to say no when memory kicked in. Wait. And last Thursday, while I was out, Theodore accepted a package marked Personal Materials. Handle with care. Fritz mentioned it was addressed to you. Said Theodore put it in your room. Wolfe's eyes narrowed. Show me. We found the package on the table by his bedroom window, wrapped in brown paper with meticulous precision. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a sealed envelope. Wolfe broke the wax seal and read the enclosed letter in silence before handing it to me. The handwriting was precise and urgent. Mr. Wolfe. If you are reading this, I am dead under circumstances that will be labeled natural, but are not. This journal documents every illegal operation my firm has conducted, plus evidence proving which of my partners has been systematically poisoning me. I trust you to ensure justice rather than profit. The journal is coded. Look to the orchids. Always the orchids. J. Kincaid. So he really was murdered, Elena whispered, and one of my former partners is the killer. Wolfe opened the journal to reveal pages of symbols that bore no resemblance to any standard alphabet. Mr. Kincaid was correct about my ability to decode this. Archie, summon Theodore from the plant rooms. 10 minutes later, Theodore Horstman stood over the journal with the focused intensity he usually reserved for ailing orchids. It's elegant, he said finally. Each symbol corresponds to letters based on Paphiopedilum species names, following taxonomic classification. Give me an hour. You have 30 minutes, Wolfe said. After that, we prepare for war. While Theodore worked upstairs, I made a reconnaissance trip to the Argus Group offices. The 14th floor of their Fifth Avenue building reeked of expensive anxiety. Arthur Cole received me in an office that screamed success while whispering desperation. Let's not play games, Mr. Goodwin. he said after the usual pleasantries. If Wolfe has the ledger, he's holding a nuclear device. My partners have different risk management styles. Thorne prefers preemptive strikes. Lila prefers surgical removal. I prefer transactions. And if Mr. Wolfe doesn't cooperate? Cole's practiced smile flickered. Then I can't stop what happens next. Thorne is convinced the only safety lies in eliminating threats entirely. I got a glimpse of Thorne himself on my way out. Broad, thick-necked, with the flat eyes of a predator. He watched me walk to the elevator without saying a word, but his stare felt like ice water down my spine. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe standing motionless beside his desk, staring at his jade pencil vase with the expression of a man who just discovered a rattlesnake in his sock drawer. "Someone has been in this room again," he said quietly. "The vase has been rotated. The carved dragon was facing southeast when I left for the plant rooms. It now faces south. I checked the locked windows, the undisturbed papers, the perfectly arranged books. Nothing missing, nothing broken. Just the subtle message that nowhere was truly safe." "They're escalating," I said. "Indeed." Wolfe's voice carried the deadly calm that preceded his most devastating moves. "They believe psychological pressure will weaken our resolve. They are about to discover their error." Theodore appeared in the doorway, holding the decoded journal like a loaded weapon. "Thus I have it," he said simply. "All of it." Wolfe took the translation and read in silence for 3 minutes. When he looked up, his expression was that of a judge preparing to pass sentence. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "tomorrow evening we will have the distinct pleasure of exposing a murderer." The war had just taken a decisive turn in our favor. The decoded journal lay spread across Wolfe's desk like evidence in a capital case, which, I reflected grimly, it probably was. Theodore had done his usual meticulous work, every symbol translated, every entry cross-referenced, every date verified. What emerged was 3 years of systematic documentation by a man who had discovered that one of his business partners was slowly poisoning him to death. Wolfe read through the translation with the focused intensity he usually reserved for rare cookbooks, his lips pushing in and out in the rhythm that meant his brain was processing information at maximum capacity. When he finished, he set the pages down as carefully as if they contained nitroglycerin. "Archie," he said, "summon Saul. I want his report on our watchers." I got Saul Panzer on the line. He was parked on 10th Avenue, and his voice carried the satisfied tone of a man who had just solved an interesting puzzle. "Your neighborhood's been busy," he reported. 2 fixed observation posts and 1 mobile unit circling every 30 minutes since yesterday. The stationary teams are disciplined. No smoking breaks, no wandering attention spans, no amateur mistakes. This is professional surveillance. Not some insurance investigator with a camera. "Can you connect them to our 3 suspects?" "The van on 34th Street is registered to a shell company that traces back to Marcus Thorne. 2 men inside, working 12-hour shifts with high-end equipment. They've been documenting everyone who enters or leaves the brownstone for at least a week. I also found something interesting about your break-ins." I covered the mouthpiece and relayed this to Wolfe, who nodded grimly. "Continue," I told Saul. "Whoever picked your service entrance lock used techniques specific to government training, FBI, CIA, maybe military intelligence. Your average private investigator wouldn't know these methods. Also, they were careful enough to reset the pins afterward, which suggests they plan to return." After I hung up, the Wolfe turned his attention back to the journal. "Mr. Kincaid was methodical in documenting his own murder," he said, his voice carrying the chill of an Arctic wind. "The entries begin 18 months ago with vague symptoms: fatigue, nausea, difficulty concentrating. He initially attributed them to stress." He read from the translation. "November 12th. Consulted privately with Dr. Harmon, who confirmed my suspicions. Someone has been administering digitalis in small, regular doses. The symptoms match classic chronic poisoning. I have narrowed the suspects to 3 individuals, all of whom have motive, means, and opportunity. So he knew he was being murdered, I said, but kept working with his killers. Because he needed to identify which one was responsible, Wolfe replied. You read the entry from December 15th. Kincaid had conducted what he called a controlled experiment, arranging separate meetings with each partner and consuming only beverages they had prepared. The results were conclusive. After consuming coffee prepared by MT, symptoms intensified dramatically within 2 hours. Pulse irregular, severe nausea, vision problems. The identity of my murderer is now confirmed. MT, I said. Marcus Thorne. Indeed. But observe the final entries. Wolfe turned to the last pages of the translation. Mr. Kincaid discovered that Thorne had been adding digitalis extract to his morning coffee on Tuesdays and Thursdays, days when Thorne arrived early to review security protocols. The poison was derived from foxglove plants, are easily obtainable and difficult to detect in routine examinations. The phone rang at that moment with the kind of timing that makes you wonder if someone upstairs is writing your life as a bad melodrama. I answered to find Elena Vasquez on the line, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Mr. Wolfe, Lila Banning just called me. She knows I've been working with you. She said if I show up at tomorrow night's meeting, I'll never leave your brownstone alive. Wolfe took the phone from me. Mrs. Vasquez, did Ms. Banning specify how she acquired this knowledge? She said she's been monitoring all my phone calls since yesterday. She knows everything we've discussed, every plan we've made. Excellent, Wolfe said, which was not the response I would have expected. That confirms she possesses the technical capability for electronic surveillance. It also confirms that our investigation has progressed far enough to threaten her directly. Please inform Ms. Banning that you will indeed attend tomorrow's meeting and that her threats have been noted for future reference. After Eleanor hung up, I stared at Wolfe with the expression of a man watching his boss play poker with a deck of dynamite. You're using her as bait. I am using her as confirmation, Wolfe corrected. If Ms. Banning is monitoring our communications, she now knows we possess the decoded journal. She will inform her partners immediately. All 3 will arrive tomorrow evening in a state of heightened anxiety and compromised judgment. That is precisely the condition we require for maximum effectiveness. He stood and moved to the window, the hands clasped behind his back, studying 35th Street as if it were a battlefield map. The journal provides motive and method, but we need confession to ensure conviction. Thorne's military background explains his access to surveillance techniques and his comfort with violence. The systematic nature of the poisoning demonstrates planning and patience, but there are gaps in Mr. Kincaid's documentation that only direct confrontation will fill. What kind of gaps? Why Thorne chose murder over simpler alternatives. Whether he acted alone or had assistance, and most importantly, what triggered the escalation from business partner to killer? Wolfe turned from the window. Mr. Kincaid suspected the answer lay in events that predated their business relationship, but he died before confirming his theory. I made notes while Wolfe outlined his strategy for tomorrow's confrontation. The plan was typically elaborate, multiple layers of psychological pressure designed to crack Thorne's composure and force admissions that would supplement the journal's evidence. Archie, call Fred Durkin and Ori Cather. I want them positioned strategically tomorrow evening. Fred in the front hall, Ori covering the service entrance. Also contact Inspector Kramer. Tell him we may require police presence at 9:30 tomorrow night, but emphasize that early arrival would compromise the entire operation. As I made the calls, Wolfe returned to studying Kincaid's journal with the intensity of a general reviewing battle plans. When I finished with the phone, he had compiled a list of specific entries, each marked with a red check. These passages establish the timeline and method of Mr. Thorne's systematic poisoning, he said, tapping the marked pages. They also reveal something Mr. Kincaid discovered in his final week, evidence that transformed his murder from a business necessity into personal revenge. What did he find? That his death was not merely about silencing a potential whistleblower. It was about settling a score that had nothing to do with the Argus Group's current operations. Wolfe closed the journal with finality. Tomorrow evening we shall learn exactly what that score was and why Marcus Thorne believed it worth committing murder to settle. The brownstone settled into its evening routine, but the atmosphere remained charged with anticipation. See, Fritz moved through his duties with the heightened awareness of a man expecting artillery fire instead of dinner guests. Upstairs, Elena Vasquez was presumably facing the particular insomnia reserved for people whose past had suddenly become a loaded weapon aimed at their future. When I finally made my rounds before bed, Wolfe was still in his chair, the decoded journal open on his lap, his eyes closed in concentration. Tomorrow night, 3 people who had built careers on secrets and surveillance would enter his office believing they could manipulate the situation to their advantage. They were about to discover that Nero Wolfe's brownstone was not merely a target. It was a carefully constructed trap, and they had just walked into it. Friday morning brought the kind of methodical preparation that Nero Wolfe approaches like a master chef planning a 7-course dinner. At 8:15, Fritz served shirred eggs with truffle sauce, and Wolfe consumed them with the deliberate precision of a man who had decided that impending warfare was no excuse for neglecting breakfast. The decoded journal lay beside his coffee cup like a loaded weapon, its pages marked with red ink where he'd identified the most damaging passages. "Archie," he said without looking up from his eggs, "this morning you will visit the Argus Group offices, not to investigate, to be seen investigating. I want our 3 guests arriving tonight already convinced that their secrets are no longer secret." Rattle their cages? Precisely. Also, ours make use of our electronic audience. He gestured toward the basement, where Lila Banning's wiretap continued its faithful eavesdropping. Discuss our negotiations loudly enough for her equipment to record our apparent willingness to compromise. Let them believe we are more interested in profit than justice. I spent 20 minutes on the phone with a fictional lawyer, discussing terms for returning sensitive materials in exchange for appropriate compensation. If Lila was listening, and she was, she heard exactly what Wolfe wanted her to hear. A greedy detective and his assistant preparing to auction off Julian Kincaid's secrets to the highest bidder. The Argus Group offices occupied the 14th floor of a 5th Avenue building that reeked of expensive desperation. I arrived at 10:30, armed with a notebook and the kind of cheerful persistence that drives guilty people to distraction. The receptionist informed me that all 3 partners were available, which told me they'd been expecting my visit. Arthur Cole received me in his corner office, wearing the expression of a man who'd spent the night calculating the odds of survival. "Mr. Goodwin, I trust this morning's visit indicates Mr. Wolfe's willingness to discuss reasonable terms." "That depends on your definition of reasonable," I said, settling into the chair across from his mahogany desk. "Tell me about Julian Kincaid's final week. Who had access to his office, his coffee, his personal belongings?" Cole's practiced composure flickered like a candle in wind. Julian was under considerable stress. The business was expanding rapidly, and he had concerns about certain operational procedures, but nothing suggested he was in immediate danger from anyone inside the firm. Even though someone was systematically poisoning him with digitalis. The color drained from Cole's face as if someone had pulled a plug. His hands gripped the desk edge, knuckles white against the dark wood. That's a very serious accusation. It's a documented fact. Mr. Kincaid kept detailed records of his symptoms, his suspicions, and eventually his proof. We'll be discussing those records tonight, 9 o'clock sharp. Marcus Thorne intercepted me at the elevator, his bulk filling the hallway with the casual menace of a professional enforcer. Up close, he was even more intimidating, broad shoulders, flat eyes, and the kind of stillness that suggested coiled violence. "Goodwin," he said, and his voice carrying the emotional warmth of a glacier. "You're making a mistake coming here." "Funny, I was about to say the same thing about you murdering your business partner." I kept my voice conversational, but my hand drifted toward my shoulder holster. "Julian figured out your schedule, didn't he? Tuesdays and Thursdays, early morning security reviews. Perfect opportunity to doctor his coffee." Thorne's eyes went completely dead. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know Julian Kincaid documented every dose. I know he identified the poison source, and I know he made sure his evidence would survive him." I stepped closer, close enough to see the muscle twitching in his jaw. "Tonight, we'll see how well your military training prepared you for a different kind of warfare." Lila Banning caught me in the lobby, moving with the precise efficiency of a guided missile. She was smaller than I'd expected, but radiated the focused intensity of someone accustomed to controlling complex systems. "Mr. Goodwin, a moment." She gestured toward a quiet corner away from security cameras. "I've been monitoring your communications. I know what you think you've discovered about Julian's death." "And what do we think we've discovered?" "Evidence pointing toward Marcus Thorne. But you're missing crucial context. Thorne didn't have the technical sophistication for this kind of operation. The timing, the dosage calculations, the method of delivery. He needed assistance." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm prepared to provide testimony that ensures his conviction, if in exchange for immunity from prosecution." "Generous of you to throw your partner under the bus. I prefer to call it survival instinct. Marcus is dangerous, but he's also stupid. Julian's murder was sloppy, poorly planned. If I'd been involved, you never would have found the evidence." Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe arranging the office like a general positioning artillery. The journal lay open on his desk, flanked by neat stacks of Theodore's translations. Every detail had been calculated to maximum psychological impact. "All three are rattled," I reported. "Cole's terrified, Thorne's dangerous, and Banning just offered to sell out her partners in exchange for immunity." "Excellent," Wolfe said, which wasn't the reaction I'd expected. "Ms. Banning's offer confirms she believes Thorne is guilty, or wants us to believe she believes it. Either way, it suggests tonight's confrontation will produce the pressure necessary for truth." Fred Durkin arrived at 6 to take his position in the front hall. Ori Cather appeared at 7 to cover the service entrance. Saul Panzer called at 8 to confirm all 3 suspects were en route, each traveling separately, each being discreetly followed by one of his operatives. Elena Vasquez arrived at 8:30, looking like someone who'd spent the day contemplating mortality. Fritz settled her in the front room with coffee strong enough to dissolve steel, then retreated to prepare what he described as appropriate refreshments for difficult conversations. At 8:55, then I took my position at my desk, notebook ready, and the decoded journal within easy reach. Through the one-way glass, I could see the street where our 3 suspects would soon arrive, each carrying their own version of guilt and desperation. The war Nero Wolfe had declared was about to begin, in earnest. Arthur Cole arrived first at 8:58, which told me everything I needed to know about his state of mind. Men who show up early for their own execution are usually hoping to negotiate a stay. I let him cool his heels in the front hall for exactly 2 minutes before escorting him to the office, where Wolfe sat behind his desk like a mountain that had decided to hold court. Cole settled into the red leather chair with the careful precision of someone navigating a minefield. His charcoal suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, but sweat beaded along his hairline despite the November chill. He glanced at the decoded journal on Wolfe's desk, and his Adam's apple bobbed once, hard. "Mr. Wolfe," he began, his voice carrying the practiced smoothness of a man who made his living managing crises. "I appreciate your willingness to discuss this matter before involving the authorities. Perhaps we can reach an understanding that benefits everyone involved." Wolfe didn't rise, didn't nod, didn't offer so much as a grunt of acknowledgement. We will discuss nothing until your partners arrive, Mr. Cole. All conversations will occur in their collective presence. I prefer efficiency to repetition. The doorbell rang at 9:03. Marcus Thorne filled the doorway like a human avalanche, his bulk making the office feel suddenly smaller. But he moved with the controlled aggression of a man who had decided that intimidation was his primary defense strategy. When he took the yellow chair, the leather creaked under his weight, and I noticed his right hand remained close to his jacket, a habit that suggested he wasn't relying entirely on conversation to resolve the evening's difficulties. "Let's skip the theater, Wolfe," he said, his voice carrying the flat menace of a loaded weapon. "You claim to have Kincaid's so-called ledger. We're here to negotiate its return. Name your price and let's finish this." "There will be no negotiation, Mr. Thorne," Wolfe replied with the calm precision of a judge reading a death sentence. "There will be confession, followed by arrest. The only variable is whether you cooperate now or after additional evidence makes cooperation irrelevant." Lila Banning arrived at 9:06, moving with the focused efficiency of a surgeon approaching a particularly challenging operation. She was smaller than her telephone voice had suggested, perhaps 5'3", with steel-gray hair cut severely short, and eyes that catalogued every detail of the room in 3 seconds flat. She took the remaining chair and pulled a notebook from her bag with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to documenting other people's secrets. "Cozy arrangement," she said, her gaze moving from Cole's nervous perspiration to Thorne's coiled tensions of the journal that commanded the center of Wolfe's desk. "I assume you've swept for electronic surveillance, given your recent concerns about privacy violations." "An interesting question from someone who has spent the past 48 hours monitoring my telephone communications," Wolfe observed. "I assure you, Ms. Banning, this conversation will be recorded only by Mr. Goodwin's shorthand, a technology that predates your electronic expertise by several centuries." I opened my notebook with a flourish, enjoying the way all 3 suspects tracked the movement. Elena Vasquez remained in the front room, but her presence hung over the office like a sword waiting to fall. Wolfe leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, surveying his guests with the expression of a general who had already won the battle and was simply waiting for the enemy to realize their position was hopeless. "You are here," he began, "nay, because you believe I possess Julian Kincaid's ledger, and that I might be persuaded, by money, by threats, or by force, to surrender it. You are correct about possession, but mistaken about persuasion. Mr. Kincaid entrusted me with his records not for your benefit, but to ensure justice for his murder." The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Cole went pale. Banning's pen stopped moving across her notebook. Thorne's hands gripped the chair arms with enough force to leave permanent impressions. "Murder?" Cole's voice cracked on the word. "Julian died of heart failure. The coroner signed the death certificate. You're making wild accusations without foundation." "The coroner," Wolfe said, opening the journal to a marked page, "examined a man whose symptoms perfectly matched cardiac failure in a high-stress profession, so he had no reason to suspect chronic digitalis poisoning, which mimics heart disease with remarkable precision when administered properly over time." He began reading from Theodore's translation. "November 12th. Consulted privately with Dr. Harmon regarding persistent symptoms. Blood analysis confirms digitalis poisoning. Dosage suggests regular, small amounts over extended period. Suspect narrowed to 3 individuals with means, motive, and opportunity." Lila Banning leaned forward, her professional composure intact but strained. If Julian suspected poisoning, why didn't he go to the police immediately? Why continue working with people he believed were trying to kill him? Because Mr. Kincaid was not content merely to identify his murderer. He wanted to expose the entire criminal enterprise you 3 have been operating under the Argus Group's legitimate cover. Wolfe turned to another marked passage. Corporate blackmail, political manipulation, illegal surveillance. He documented everything, including specific operations, client names, and financial transactions that would interest federal prosecutors considerably. "This is fantasy," Cole protested, but his voice lacked conviction and his hands trembled as he reached for his handkerchief. "Is it fantasy that you embezzled $600,000 from the firm's operating accounts over 18 months? Wolfe asked with deadly calm. Mr. Kincaid traced the transactions through 4 shell companies before they disappeared into your personal holdings in the Cayman Islands. No, he also documented your attempts to cover the theft by inflating client billings and creating fictional expenses." Cole's face went ashen. Beside him, Thorne's expression had hardened into something resembling granite, while Banning maintained her professional mask, despite the slight tremor in her left hand. "And you, Ms. Banning," Wolfe continued relentlessly, "used the firm's surveillance capabilities to conduct illegal wiretaps for private clients, selling sensitive information to the highest bidder." Mr. Kincaid identified 23 separate instances, including recordings of a federal judge whose rulings became remarkably favorable to certain interests after you provided compromising material to their attorneys. Banning's composure cracked slightly. Julian was hardly innocent himself. He built this business on secrets and leverage. We all knew the risks. Indeed, which is why he felt qualified to judge when his partners crossed lines even he considered inviolable. Wolfe's voice carried the chill of an executioner reading final charges. But only one of you crossed the ultimate line. Only one decided that murder was preferable to exposure or reform. The silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Thorne had gone absolutely still, his breathing controlled, his eyes locked on Wolfe with the intensity of a predator calculating angles of attack. "You're accusing me," he said flatly. "I'm stating facts documented by your victim with scientific precision." Wolfe opened the journal to its final entries. On December 15th, Mr. Kincaid conducted a controlled experiment. He consumed beverages prepared separately by each of you during individual meetings. Only the coffee you prepared, Mr. Thorne, produced severe symptoms consistent with acute digitalist poisoning. He documented the results with clinical thoroughness, then repeated the experiment twice more to eliminate variables. "Coincidence," Thorne said, but his voice had lost its earlier menace. Julian was already sick. Any pattern he thought he saw was confirmed by toxicological analysis, Wolfe interrupted. But the journal establishes more than method and opportunity. It also reveals motive that extends far beyond business disagreements. He turned to a passage near the beginning of the translation. 22 years ago, you and Mr. Kincaid served together in military intelligence. As you were dishonorably discharged for selling classified information to foreign agents. Mr. Kincaid's testimony at your court-martial was instrumental in your conviction. For the first time, genuine emotion flickered across Thorne's face, a flash of old rage, carefully banked but never extinguished, suddenly exposed like a nerve under pressure. "Julian destroyed my career," he said quietly, his voice carrying 20 years of accumulated hatred. "Cost me my pension, my reputation, my future. Everything I'd worked for, gone because he couldn't keep his mouth shut about things that didn't concern him. So when he offered you employment 5 years ago," Wolfe continued, "you saw an opportunity for revenge disguised as reconciliation." "I saw a chance to rebuild my life," Thorne corrected. "But Julian never let me forget who held the power. And every decision, every assignment, every dollar came with reminders of my past mistakes. He enjoyed having me under his thumb." Cole made a sound like a wounded animal. "Marcus, you never said—" "I had no idea about your history with Julian." "Because it wasn't your business," Thorne snapped. "Just like it wasn't Julian's business to threaten everything we'd built here because his conscience suddenly started bothering him." Wolfe's eyebrows rose fractionally. "Ah, so Mr. Kincaid was planning to dissolve the firm and cooperate with federal authorities?" "He called it cleaning house," Thorne said, his voice bitter with memory. "Said he wanted to make amends before retirement, turn over our files in exchange for immunity, and he would have walked away clean while the rest of us went to prison." So you decided to prevent his cooperation through permanent means. I decided to survive, Thorne said flatly. Julian had already ruined my life once. I wasn't going to let him do it again. The confession hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Cole stared at his partner with horror and dawning comprehension. Banning had gone completely still, her calculating mind undoubtedly reassessing every assumption about her associates and her own legal exposure. Wolfe closed the journal with deliberate finality. Mr. Thorne, you have just confessed to premeditated murder in the presence of witnesses. Do you wish to add anything before Mr. Goodwin summons Inspector Kramer? Thorne looked around the room, taking in Cole's shock, Banning's cold assessment, to my ready pen, and Wolfe's implacable certainty. For a moment, something like resignation crossed his features. Yeah, he said finally. I want to add that Julian Kincaid was a self-righteous bastard who got exactly what he deserved, and if I had to do it again, I would. The doorbell rang at that precise moment, announcing Inspector Kramer's arrival with the timing of a perfectly orchestrated finale. Through the front hall, I could hear Fred's distinctive murmur explaining the situation to New York's finest. Justice, it seemed, was punctual as well as inevitable. Inspector Kramer entered the office with the weary determination of a man who had spent 30 years cleaning up other people's messes, followed by Sergeant Pearlie Stebbins and 2 uniformed officers who filled the doorway like a small army. And he surveyed the scene with one comprehensive glance. 3 suspects arranged in their chairs, Wolfe enthroned behind his desk, and me with my notebook documenting what was clearly the endgame of an investigation that had unfolded without his knowledge. Wolfe, he said, pulling out one of his ruinous cigars without lighting it. When you called and said to arrive at 9:30 with handcuffs, I should have known you'd already wrapped everything up with a bow. Inspector, Wolfe replied with evident satisfaction, may I present Marcus Thorne, who has just confessed to the premeditated murder of Julian Kincaid through systematic digitalist poisoning administered over 18 months. Mr. Goodwin's notes contain the complete admission, including motive, method, and a rather illuminating statement about his victim deserving death. Kramer's eyes narrowed as he studied Thorne, who sat with the rigid stillness of a man who had calculated his odds and found them wanting. That's a serious confession. I assume you have more than his word obtained in your parlor without proper procedure. Wolfe gestured toward the decoded journal. Mr. Kincaid documented his own murder with scientific precision. These entries established timeline, symptoms, and controlled experiments that identified his killer. Dr. Harmon also retained blood samples confirming chronic digitalist poisoning. The coroner ruled heart failure, Kramer pointed out, because Mr. Kincaid's symptoms perfectly mimicked cardiac arrest in a high-stress individual. The coroner had no reason to suspect murder. Wolfe opened the journal to its final entries. These pages contain not only proof of Mr. Thorne's guilt, but documentation of extensive criminal activities that will interest federal prosecutors considerably. Arthur Cole made a sound between a cough and a sob. Inspector, I had no knowledge of Julian's murder. None whatsoever. If I had known what Marcus was doing. You would have done nothing, Thorne interrupted with contempt. You were too busy embezzling company funds to notice anything beyond your own greed. At least I had the courage to act when action was necessary. Courage, Wolfe repeated with Arctic disdain. An interesting characterization for poisoning an unsuspecting colleague. Most would call it cowardice of the most contemptible variety. Lila Banning had remained silent, but now she spoke with calculated precision. Inspector Kramer, I'm prepared to provide testimony regarding Mr. Thorne's activities in exchange for immunity from prosecution. I can document his movements, his access to Mr. Kincaid's office, and his acquisition of the poison. How convenient, Thorne snarled, that you suddenly remember these details now that I'm facing arrest. Tell him about the surveillance equipment you provided, Lila. Tell him how you helped me track Julian's schedule so I'd know exactly when he'd be alone with his coffee. Banning's composure finally cracked. I provided equipment for legitimate security purposes. What you did with it was your decision. You knew exactly what I was doing, Thorne shot back. You even suggested the dosage schedule. Small amounts on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Nothing that would trigger immediate suspicion. You said it would look like natural deterioration. The confession within the accusation hung in the air like cordite. Kramer's expression shifted to the focused intensity of a predator who had spotted wounded prey. Ms. Banning, you might want to reconsider that immunity request. Accessory to murder carries significant weight. Kramer gestured to his officers. Take Mr. Thorne into custody. Murder 1, premeditated. Ms. Banning and Mr. Cole, you're both coming downtown for questioning regarding accessory charges and the other criminal activities Mr. Wolfe mentioned. As the handcuffs clicked shut, Thorne looked directly at Wolfe with something approaching respect beneath the hatred. You know what's funny? Julian always said you were the only honest detective in New York. It turns out he was right about that at least. Mr. Kincaid was correct about many things, Wolfe replied, including the identity of his murderer and the inevitability of justice. The procession out had the solemn quality of a funeral march. Thorne moved with resigned dignity. Banning maintained professional composure even in handcuffs, and Cole simply looked broken. After they departed, Kramer remained, studying Wolfe with mixed gratitude and irritation. You could have called me earlier, saved everyone trouble, and denied you a confession obtained before multiple witnesses. I think not, Inspector. Besides, Mr. Thorne's admission required psychological pressure that only private confrontation could provide. Maybe, but one of these days, your theatrical approach will backfire spectacularly. Perhaps, but not today. After Kramer left with his prisoners and evidence, Elena Vasquez emerged from the front room, her face showing the peculiar relief of someone finally permitted to set down an impossible weight. "It's over," she asked. "For you," I said. "Your cooperation will weigh favorably should questions arise about your former employment." After Elena departed, the brownstone settled into its customary silence, the invasion repelled, sanctity restored. Wolfe sat behind his desk, the journal closed before him, wearing the contentment of a man who had defended his territory and emerged victorious. "Archie," he said finally, "inform Fritz we will dine at 8:30. I believe he mentioned duck with cherry sauce. After solving a murder, you're thinking about dinner." "I'm always thinking about dinner," Wolfe replied. The advantage of resolving unpleasant business efficiently is that it leaves adequate time for life's more civilized pleasures." Through the window, 35th Street had returned to ordinary rhythm. The surveillance van had vanished. The brownstone stood inviolate once more, its master having demonstrated why disturbing Nero Wolfe's peace ended badly for those foolish enough to attempt it. Justice had been served. Now dinner would follow, as it always did in that house where order and appetite remained civilization's twin pillars. The silence that settled over the brownstone after Kramer's departure carried the profound weight of order restored. I locked the front door with the satisfaction of a man who had just watched justice march 3 criminals out in handcuffs, but then returned to the office, where Wolfe sat behind his desk, like a mountain that had successfully defended its territory. Fritz appeared almost immediately, moving with the relieved efficiency of a man whose world had snapped back into proper alignment. "Sir, I have taken the liberty of replacing the contaminated marjoram with fresh herbs from our supplier. Also, dinner will be ready at 8:30 as planned. The duck with cherry sauce is, if I may say so, perfection." "Excellent, Fritz. Tomorrow we will conduct a complete inventory of the spice cabinet. I want verification that nothing else was tampered with." Wolfe's voice carried the satisfaction of a general who had not only won a battle but ensured his supply lines remained secure. The phone rang at 8:20, which under normal circumstances would have been an unwelcome interruption of pre-dinner tranquility. But given the evening's events, I approached it with the wariness of a man who had learned that telephones could deliver more than inconvenience. "Nero Wolfe's office," I said. "Goodwin speaking." "Mr. Goodwin." The voice was quiet, educated, and carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had been wrestling with conscience for months. "My name is Dr. Leo Harmon. I believe Mr. Wolfe may want to speak with me about Julian Kincaid." I covered the mouthpiece and looked at Wolfe, who had closed his book and was listening with the expression of a man who had expected this call but hoped it wouldn't come during dinner preparations. "Dr. Harmon," I said into the phone, "you couldn't have picked an earlier time in the last 18 months? Julian asked me not to go to the police. He said he'd arranged a different path to justice. Inspector Kramer called an hour ago. He said Mr. Wolfe had exposed Kincaid's murderer and suggested I might want to clear my conscience before the press got hold of things." I brought him into the office 10 minutes later. Dr. Leo Harmon was younger than his telephone voice suggested, perhaps 50, with graying hair and the kind of careful posture that comes from carrying a heavy burden for too long. He clutched a battered leather briefcase as if it contained either salvation or damnation, and from his expression, he wasn't sure which. "Dr. Harmon," Wolfe said without rising, "you're late." "I imagine I am. But I came." Harmon settled into the red leather chair with the careful precision of someone navigating a minefield. "I brought the blood work, the toxicology reports, everything Julian made me promise to keep secret." Wolfe gestured toward the briefcase. "Show me." The folder Harmon produced was thick enough to satisfy a district attorney and damning enough to convict a dozen murderers. Lab reports, blood analyses, toxicology studies, all documenting the systematic poisoning of Julian Kincaid with scientific precision that would make Thorne's confession seem almost redundant. "I diagnosed the digitalis poisoning 4 months ago," Harmon said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Subtherapeutic doses, administered regularly. Someone was walking him right up to the edge of cardiac failure. I told him to go to the police immediately, as he refused." "Why?" Wolfe asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "He said if he went in half-prepared, they'd cut deals that left his partners free to rebuild somewhere else. He wanted to document everything, not just his murder, but the entire criminal enterprise. He said he needed time to gather evidence that would destroy them completely." Wolfe leaned back in his chair. "And you agreed to this delay?" "I honored his choice," Harmon said defensively. "He was my patient, not my prisoner, but I kept the blood samples, stored them off-site. I told myself if something happened, at least there would be proof." "There was proof," Wolfe said coldly. "Mr. Kincaid documented his own murder with scientific thoroughness. Your samples merely confirm what his journal already established." Harmon flinched as if he'd been struck. "You think I should have acted anyway? Violated his trust, gone to the authorities despite his wishes?" "I think you confused respect for autonomy with abdication of responsibility," Wolfe replied. "But that is between you and your conscience. The law will be satisfied with your evidence and Mr. Thorne's confession." After Harmon departed, carrying his guilt like a visible weight, Saul Panzer called with his final report. The surveillance operation had been even more extensive than we'd realized. 2 fixed observation posts, 1 mobile unit, and enough electronic equipment to monitor half of Manhattan. They had detailed schedules of our movements, photographs of everyone who entered the brownstone, and floor plans obtained through methods that suggested either bribed city inspectors or sophisticated computer infiltration. "One more thing," Saul added. "Found a listening device behind the radiator in your front room. Military grade, probably placed during Thorne's security review last week. They've been monitoring your conversations for days." That explained how they had anticipated our moves so precisely. It also explained why Wolfe's strategy of using their electronic surveillance against them had worked so effectively. At dinner, the duck with cherry sauce lived up to Fritz's advance publicity. Wolfe consumed it with the methodical appreciation of a man who had successfully defended his territory and could now return to life's more civilized pleasures. We discussed the decline of American cherries compared to their European counterparts, a subject on which Wolfe held passionate and highly specific opinions. Back in the office afterward, and with coffee and brandy, the mood shifted to philosophical reflection. Wolfe settled into his chair, the yellow light from the reading lamp casting familiar shadows across the room that had been violated, but was now restored. "It is remarkable," he observed, swirling his brandy, "how men of intelligence can become so blinded by grievance that they mistake murder for a solution. Mr. Thorne believed that eliminating Mr. Kincaid would erase his past. Instead, it merely ensured his future would be confined to a prison cell." 20 years is a long time to carry a grudge, I said. "Resentment is a poison more potent than digitalis," Wolfe agreed. "It accumulates slowly, undetected, until it corrupts every other faculty. Mr. Thorne's military training taught him efficiency but deprived him of perspective. He saw Mr. Kincaid not as a human being but as an obstacle to be removed." "And Banning?" "Ms. Banning suffers from a different affliction, the belief that loyalty is transactional. She supported Mr. Thorne only as long as it was profitable. When circumstances shifted, so did her allegiance. Such people are dangerous precisely because they are predictable only in their selfishness." I finished typing my notes and locked them in the desk drawer. The spice jar had been returned to its proper position. The Jade Dragon faced southeast. The photographs had gone to the police as evidence. The watchers on 34th Street had vanished like a bad dream. "You know," I said, "for a man who never leaves this house, you make quite an impression on people who come trying to rearrange it." Wolfe looked up from his book, the biography of Escoffier he had been reading when the first threatening phone call arrived 2 days ago. "Then perhaps they will stay away longer next time. Until the next one decides your peace is negotiable." "The next one," he said, turning a page with deliberate satisfaction, "will be wrong too." The brownstone had returned to its proper rhythm. Outside, the city continued its chaotic existence. Inside, order reigned supreme, defended successfully against those who had mistaken Nero Wolfe's preference for tranquility as weakness rather than strength. The phone call that had started this case had taught our enemies a valuable lesson. There are better hobbies than watching Nero Wolfe. Surviving him, for example, was considerably more challenging than they had anticipated. Saturday morning arrived with the crystalline indifference of a November day that knew nothing of poisoning, surveillance, or corporate treachery. I came downstairs at 9 to find Fritz already engaged in his systematic restoration of the brownstone's violated sanctity, moving through rooms with the focused intensity of a priest performing purification rituals. The spice cabinet had been completely emptied, scrubbed with the thoroughness of a surgical suite, and was being restocked with fresh supplies from our most trusted vendors. At 9 o'clock sharp, I followed Nero Wolfe up to the plant rooms, where the elevator's familiar groan provided the comforting soundtrack of restored routine. The morning ritual was sacred, 2 hours with the orchids, uninterrupted by crime, clients, or the presumptions of people who mistook watching for wisdom. Wolfe moved through the aisles of Catalia with the focused serenity of a high priest attending his flock. He stopped at a bench of Paphiopedilum, the very species that had sparked his interest before Thursday's threatening phone call had shattered our peaceful morning, and examined each bloom with a magnifying glass. Theodore reported that Wolfe had spent an extra hour the previous evening conducting what could only be described as a security inspection of his orchids, apparently satisfied that no one had tampered with his most precious possessions. "Archie," he said, his voice muffled by the humid foliage, "note that this Rothschildianum requires repotting. The medium is decomposing and must be attended to by Monday." "Noted," I said, scribbling on my pad. Tom also noted, "We have a living client, Elena Vasquez, who helped us solve a murder but is currently unemployed and likely blacklisted by every security firm in the city. She can't pay us in anything other than gratitude, which doesn't cover Fritz's grocery bills. Who exactly am I billing for this little adventure?" Wolfe didn't look up from the orchid. Mr. Kincaid engaged our services, albeit posthumously. His instructions were clear, his journal constituted a binding contract, and his estate is substantial. Send the bill to his executor, include expenses for wiretap detection, replacement of contaminated spices, and a consulting fee for Ms. Vasquez's cooperation. And a premium for invasion of privacy. A substantial one, Wolfe grunted, moving to examine the next specimen. Discomfort is expensive, Archie, and presumption is considerably more so. Back in the office at 11, I typed up an invoice that gave me particular satisfaction. Calculating the cost of Nero Wolfe's irritation was an exercise in creative accounting that I approached with genuine enthusiasm. By the time I finished, the morning papers had arrived with headlines screaming about the Argus Group scandal and poison plot exposed. Wolfe's name appeared in the third paragraph. Present enough to establish his role, absent enough to discourage reporters from camping on our doorstep. Inspector Kramer called at 11:30, his voice carrying the satisfied exhaustion of a man who had spent the night processing confessions and federal prosecutors. Thorne's lawyer tried to walk back the confession, he reported. Claimed it was obtained under duress in an uncontrolled environment. And then we showed him Dr. Harmon's blood work and Kincaid's journal documentation. He stopped talking about duress and started negotiating plea bargains. "And Miss Banning?" Wolfe asked, settling behind his desk with evident satisfaction. "Singing like she's auditioning for the Metropolitan Opera. She's provided documentation of every illegal operation the Argus Group conducted over 5 years. Federal prosecutors are practically writing her immunity agreement in gold ink." Kramer paused. "Though between you and me, I think she knew more about the murder than she's admitting. Those dosage calculations, the timing, that required technical expertise Thorne didn't possess." "Undoubtedly," Wolfe agreed. "But proving conspiracy requires evidence beyond logical inference. If Ms. Banning was careful enough to avoid documentation, she may escape the consequences her actions deserve." "Justice isn't always perfect," Kramer said, which for him was practically philosophy. "But 3 federal agencies are now waiving copies of that ledger and asking pointed questions about why I let a private citizen walk around with enough blackmail material to destabilize half the eastern seaboard." "You did not let anything," Wolfe replied with Arctic precision. "Mr. Kincaid chose his executor. I merely fulfilled the obligation." "Yeah, well, they'd appreciate advance notice next time you're sitting on a live grenade." "No," Wolfe said simply. After Kramer hung up, Elena Vasquez arrived for what she called a final accounting. She looked considerably better than she had 48 hours earlier, the haunted expression replaced by something approaching relief, though shadows remained around her eyes. "The federal prosecutors want me to testify about the Argus Group's operations," she said, settling into the red leather chair. "They're offering witness protection if I'm concerned about retaliation." "Are you?" I asked. "Thorne will be in prison. Banning cares only about saving herself. Cole is too broken to be dangerous." She managed a small smile. "I think I'll be fine without assuming a new identity in Nebraska." Wolfe opened his center desk drawer and withdrew an envelope. "Your fee, Mrs. Vasquez. $5,000 for information and cooperation that led to the resolution of a case threatening this household's peace." She stared at the envelope as if it might contain a live snake. "Mr. Wolfe, I came to you for help. I didn't expect payment. Nevertheless, you provided valuable intelligence at considerable personal risk. The fee is earned." He pushed the envelope across the desk with finality. "Should you require employment references for future positions, you may list this office. I suspect your analytical skills would be valued by organizations more ethical than the Argus Group." After Elena departed, carrying both the envelope and what looked like genuine hope, Wolfe returned to his newspapers with evident satisfaction. The brownstone had expelled its invaders, justice had been administered, and normal operations could resume. Fritz appeared at noon to announce that lunch would feature the saffron experiment interrupted by Thursday's crisis. This time, Wolfe tasted it with the appreciation it deserved, she pronouncing it acceptable with minor adjustments to the cardamom ratio. In the afternoon, Saul Panzer delivered his final report. The surveillance van had vanished, the spotters had dispersed, and the neighborhood had returned to its customary boredom. Even the lady with the expensive dog was walking on the other side of the street, apparently having decided our block was insufficiently interesting for her morning constitutional. By evening, the brownstone had settled into its proper rhythm with the completeness of a symphony returning to its opening theme. Wolfe spent his post-dinner hours with Escoffier, occasionally glancing up to verify that his office remained inviolate, his privacy restored, his world properly ordered according to principles that had served him well for decades. "You know," I said, finishing my notes for the day, "for a man who never leaves this house, you certainly make an impression on people who come trying to rearrange it." Wolfe looked up from his book, his expression carrying the satisfaction of a general who had successfully defended his territory. "Most consciences, Archie, are poor bookkeepers. They misplace guilt as casually as they misplace gratitude. Mrs. Vasquez at least attempted to balance her accounts. And Dr. Harmon? Dr. Harmon chose professional loyalty over moral obligation until circumstances absolved him of decision. He will call it prudence. I call it timidity with footnotes." Wolfe's lips pushed out and in twice, which on him passed for philosophical amusement. But Mr. Thorne's error was more fundamental. He confused resentment with justice, murder with solution. Like 20 years of grievance poisoned his judgment more thoroughly than Digitalis poisoned Mr. Kincaid. The phone remained mercifully silent. Outside, 35th Street had returned to its normal rhythm of taxi horns and pedestrian complaints. Inside, the brownstone hummed with the satisfied tranquility of a fortress that had repelled invasion and emerged stronger. "Boredom, Archie," Wolfe said, returning to his book, "is a linguistically imprecise term we use to describe peace. It is the natural state to which this house aspires. We have spent 3 days correcting an imbalance. The equilibrium is now restored." "Until the phone rings again," I pointed out. "Until then," Wolfe agreed, settling deeper into his chair. "But for the moment, then let us enjoy the silence of a world that has temporarily run out of ways to presume upon my patience." I swiveled my chair and looked out at the empty street, where no surveillance vans lurked and no watchers studied our windows. The detective business was officially closed until someone else decided that Nero Wolfe's peace was negotiable. Based on recent evidence, that was a mistake fewer people would be inclined to make. Peace, as our recently mailed invoice proved, was expensive. But as the restored quiet of the brownstone demonstrated, we knew exactly what it was worth. Monday morning arrived with the crystalline precision of a world restored to proper order. I found Wolfe at the breakfast table, consuming shirred eggs with the methodical satisfaction of a general who had successfully defended his territory. The morning papers carried follow-up stories about the Argus Group scandal, each reporter attempting to explain how 3 professionals in the art of surveillance had been outmaneuvered by a man who never left his brownstone. "The press," Wolfe observed, setting down the Times, "describes Mr. Thorne's confession as inevitable when it required precise psychological manipulation. They credit events without understanding causation." At 10 o'clock, a messenger delivered a certified check from Julian Kincaid's estate. The amount covered our invoice plus an additional $5,000, with a note explaining that Kincaid's will had specifically allocated funds for expenses incurred by Nero Wolfe in the execution of justice. Even in death, the man had been thorough. Saul Panzer called with his final report. and all surveillance equipment had been located and removed. The brownstone security had been upgraded with measures designed to detect future intrusions. The neighborhood watch, his network of operatives, remained alert for suspicious activity. By noon, the brownstone had achieved what Wolfe called operational tranquility. Fritz moved through his duties with restored serenity. Theodore reported all orchids unmolested. Even the jade dragon seemed satisfied in its southeast-facing position. At lunch, Wolfe consumed Fritz's saffron creation with genuine appreciation, offering only minor suggestions about cardamom ratios. The afternoon stretched ahead with nothing more demanding than correspondence and the comfortable silence of a house that had successfully repelled invasion. "You know what strikes me about Thorne," I said, finishing my typing. "He spent years watching Kincaid but never actually saw him, just saw a target for his own resentment." Wolfe looked up from his book. "That is the inherent flaw of the voyeur, Archie. In obsessing over another's actions, one ceases to inhabit one's own existence. Mr. Thorne became a ghost long before he committed murder, hollowed out until nothing remained but grievance and the technical capacity to inflict harm." He poured his afternoon beer with steady hands. "Privacy is not merely privilege, it is the soil in which character grows. When that soil is disturbed, we risk more than exposure. We risk erosion of the self." "Is that why you were so angry about the marjoram?" "The marjoram was symptom. The disease was the assumption that my life is public performance available for manipulation. It is not." That evening, so after dinner, Wolfe settled into his chair and opened his book to where he had left off Thursday morning, before the phone call that had launched 3 days of warfare against people foolish enough to disturb his peace. He read for exactly 1 hour, then closed the volume with judicial finality. "Tomorrow we resume normal operations," he said, moving toward the elevator. "Should anyone else decide that watching this house constitutes viable strategy, they will discover what Mr. Thorne learned, that presumption against Nero Wolfe yields consequences both definitive and permanent." I made my evening rounds, checking locks with the satisfaction of a man who had watched justice march 3 criminals away in handcuffs. The brownstone settled into darkness, inviolate once more. Outside, the city continued its chaotic existence. Inside, their order reigned supreme, defended, restored, and ready for whatever fool next mistook Wolfe's tranquility for weakness. The case was closed, the invoice paid, the peace restored. And if experience taught anything, someone was probably already planning the next presumption that would require correction. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight belonged to silence, satisfaction, and the comfortable certainty that some fortresses remain impregnable regardless of siege.